few more people in. How's everybody doing?
Good. Good.
So we're a good third of the way through school already. Alright, so just got a little bit of information to finish off from the end of chapter 4, and then we will start chapter 5. Any questions on any of the previous info from chapter 4 before I continue? Okay, so we were just going to look at a little bit more. We started the strength and power training adaptations. There's just a couple more that I want to go over, and then we'll look at the kind of adaptations we get through endurance training. So if we're doing strength power type work, then it's logical, I think, to understand the idea of needing more motor units contracting at the same time, right? So remember that the motor unit is the motor neuron, and all the muscle fibers that motor neuron synapses with, okay? So if I'm doing strength, I want as much force as I can generate in one contraction, okay? So that means that what we see with training, remember adaptations are typically positive, so the adaptation is going to be something that creates more force for us. And so what we see is the synchronization of motor unit firing. So we get more motor units going off at the same time, which produces more force in that contraction for the muscle. Okay? So that's great, but remember then that most of the muscle fibers that are going to be doing this are ones that are likely to fatigue quickly, right? We're going to be using our motor units that are the fatigue resistant and then the fast fatigable. All right, so both of those run out of steam very quickly, okay, because they use energy system 1 and 2. Okay? So the recruitment patterns, when they look at elite power strength athletes, are really interesting because not only do we see synchronization of motor units, but we also see recruitment patterns within the muscle change across the course of a race. So for example, there'll be a large number of motor units contracted, and then as those fatigue, another big group will contract and take on the force and the power to keep the performance going. So there are a lot of adaptations within the neural system to allow for continued force production over a slightly longer race. Right? Does that make sense? Right? Because if I'm contracting the fibers that are going to fatigue quickly, then, and I'm a rower or a sprinter, then I'm going to run out of steam before the end of the race. And so we see these switching recruitment patterns within the muscle. Really cool, it's very clever. Okay. So that's strength and power training, resistance type training. What happens with the nervous system if we're looking at endurance work instead? Because now we don't have to generate the most amount of power or the most amount of strength that we need at one go. Right? What we need now is to be able to keep contracting for a long time. Right? And so we see the flip of the synchronization in the strength training. With endurance training, we see asynchronous recruitment of the lower threshold motor units. Remember, that's because they've got a smaller cell body. That's the S motor units, the slow motor units. Right? So by recruiting the motor units asynchronously, so instead of turning them all on at the same time, I turn one on, then I turn another one, and then I turn another one, and the first one's getting a bit tired, so I turn another one on. And we turn them on at different times. It allows for the first motor unit that turned on to rest for a little while before it gets re-switched on. So synchronicity for strength power training and asynchronicity for endurance training. Right? And those adaptations allow for more efficient movement. Okay. And then I think I mentioned on Monday about the neuromuscular junction. So we get fatigue at that junction. That's because the ACH can run out, or all the receptors on the sarcolemma can be full already, and so that's a site that we know can be at risk for fatigue. And so with training, we see changes that allow for the delay of fatigue at the neuromuscular junction. So in the axon, we see more vesicles holding ACH, so there's more ACH available. And on the sarcolemma, we see more protein receptors form so that the ACH can attach to the receptor and turn on the action potential faster, right? It can reach threshold more quickly. Any questions on adaptations? So when we're thinking of this information, right, what we want is to think about how do I use these ideas, okay? Because we're not lab rats in our field. We're going to go out and work with people. So how do these principles and adaptations apply when I'm actually working with someone? So it's really important that I understand what the goal of the training is going to be, right? So that I can pick the correct specificity of training to achieve that goal, right? The type of training is going to dictate which kind of motor units are turned on, right? Which muscle fibers are contracting, and which adaptations we're going to see. Okay? So it's very important that we set the right kind of program to recruit the correct type of motor units for the end goal. Okay? And hopefully you covered in structural kinetics or in biomechanics, the biomechanical positioning can change which motor units are turned on. So I don't use the same ones if I'm squatting that I do if I'm doing a leg press, right? Because the angles are different in the leg press to the squat. Okay? So I want to pick the movement for training that is the most similar to the movement that I need to do the performance, which is why there's been this swing, I believe, in strength and conditioning. So strength and conditioning coaches now don't just do like old-fashioned training programs. Now they're always trying to think of, functional movements that are similar to the movement that you would need for the game. Okay? So the muscular system can only contract and move us around if it's talking effectively with the nervous system. So we have this large interplay between these two systems. All right? They don't work on their own. So, as I said, it's important to understand the adaptation. It's important to know what the goal of the program is so that you use the right kind of training to create the adaptation that's going to improve the performance that's the goal of the program. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so you do not need to know anything about the histochemical techniques at all. That's way outside our remit. And again, you need to know the anatomy of skeletal muscle, but the anatomy of skeletal muscle won't be on my exam. All right? But if you don't know the anatomy, then how it works, how it contracts, and what the adaptations are won't make any sense. Okay? So if you're a bit rusty on your skeletal muscle anatomy, make sure that you review that. I'm going to flip through it very quickly, so make sure you go back and look at it a little bit more carefully. Okay? So hopefully you've seen something like this before. This is just a basic organization, right? And we have our muscle fiber here, which is our muscle cell, the myofibril. Okay? And wrapping around all the myofibrils to form the muscle fiber is the sarcolemma, which is the membrane of the muscle cell. And then we have endomysium wrapping around fasciculus and perimysium. These are all connective tissues. All right? So when we think of the muscle itself as a whole, it's not just the muscle tissue. We've got all these layers of connective tissue in there as well, right? So the connective tissue has a very important role to support the muscle structure and stabilize it and divide it into its organizational levels. So the epimysium is what you would see if you looked at the muscle as a whole, right? The epimysium is wrapped around the outside of the muscle. The perimysium covers bundles of muscle fibers, and the endomysium covers individual muscle fibers, right? And they're important because they all coalesce into the tendons at either end of the muscle and attach the muscle to the skeleton. Okay? The skeleton can't move unless the muscle creates force and transmits that force via the tendon. So when we are thinking about our principles of training specificity, again, even at this level, what we want is that each organizational component adapts, and then we see adaptation in the tendon and in the bone as well. All right? So here's a muscle fiber wrapped by endomysium. The muscle fiber is the muscle cell, okay? And then we have bundles of muscle fibers wrapped around by a perimysium, and the bundle is called a fasciculus. And here you can see a slice through, a stained slice through, and so where the white is, that white would be the perimysium. So each of these little blobs inside the white outline is a muscle cell, a muscle fiber. All right? So the dark line around each blob is the endomysium. The white around a group of blobs is the perimysium, and then outside of this slide would be your epimysium. Right? So I think sometimes it helps to look at the cross-section to get a real feel for the groups of muscle fibers. And remember that we talked about our motor unit is going to turn on some of those muscle fibers, right? And all the muscle fibers turned on by one motor unit are going to be the same type, which we'll be talking about as we move through this chapter. I think we did that. We did the sheaths, we did the fourth generation. All right, the epimysium. So the epimysium wraps around the outside, allows the signal from the muscle to initiate particular fibers without spreading to other fibers in other muscles that might be close by. Right? So the epimysium is kind of the shield around the muscle so that other muscles or other tissues don't get turned on by an inappropriate signal. And then connective tissue has a little bit of give to it. It's got a little bit of elasticity, and that acts like a rubber band. So remember last week when we were talking about the vertical jump in lab, and I said that in order to test just the power of the muscle tissue, you had to wait at the bottom of the squat and then jump, right? So part of the mechanism that can be involved in adding power is this stretch shortening cycle. So the connective tissue acts like a rubber band. If I stretch it and then I let it go, boing, right? There's all that energy there, okay? So when I do step, step, bounce, vertical jump, and I stretch that connective tissue in my quads, then as I contract my quads to jump, the connective tissue adds additional power to the jump. Right? So when we're doing plyometrics, if you're doing plyometric type training, one of the things that you're working on is this connective tissue stretch shortening cycle, right? And so we use plyometric training to improve power for jumping and throwing events, for example. Okay. One of the contentions at the moment in XPhys is looking at stretching before a power event. So if you look at box, let's see, where that box is on the new oops, where's the stretching box? They moved it. Oh, okay, box 5.4, page 126. And so what a lot of research has been showing is that if you stretch immediately before a power activity, that there appears to be a negative effect from the stretching, that there's maybe a drop in power production if you stretch first. One of the ideas, one of the theories about why that might occur is connected to this idea of the stretch shortening cycle, that maybe if we stretch out the muscle and the connective tissue first, it reduces that elastic snapback when I go to do the power event. Okay? With the caveat that this is not my area of research, so I don't do anywhere near as much reading around in this area as I would like to, right? Then I would say that you want to be a little bit not skeptical, because the research isn't wrong, right? If I stretch out my calf and do a lot of static stretching, and then I immediately try to jump, the jump won't be as high, right? The research shows that. However, I think in real life, that we rarely stretch, contract the muscle, right? I mean, if you watch people getting ready for a sprint race, yes, they'll stretch out a little bit, right? But there's a big pause between the stretch and the getting down into the blocks, and then the waiting for the starter to give the signal, right? And what I haven't seen, and it may be my lack of reading, but what I haven't seen is research in that scenario, right? So if I stretch out my calf muscle and then there's this big gap before I do my power, do I see a reduction in power, right? I don't know. You are going to have to, if you're a power athlete or you're going to be working with power athletes, you're going to need to do some digging around and keep an eye on the research, right? Okay, so the bit of the muscle we're interested in from a contraction point of view, all right, is our sarcomere, right? It's the most basic contractile unit within the whole muscle, and it's the muscle fiber, the muscle cell, is a line of sarcomeres end on end to each other. Okay? So you can imagine it like a line of dominoes. One line of dominoes equals one muscle fiber or one muscle cell. Okay? And when we look at the sarcomere, there are a couple of very important things that we want to know when we look at this from our perspective. There's a lot of information here that's outside what we really need for contraction. Okay? So one of the important things to remember is that the red protein filament, which is called actin, okay? The actin is attached at one end to what we call the Z line. So each sarcomere, at the end of each sarcomere, each end has a Z line, and then it's the next sarcomere, right? So the actin filament, which is protein, is attached at one end to a Z line. That's important to understand. The other important thing to understand is that the big, thick blue protein filament here is called myosin, okay? And it overlaps the actin, all right? Now, there are a couple of other proteins pointed out here, nebulin and titin. They're not involved in the contraction concept, and so I don't spend time on those. They're there, they provide support, they provide form, but I don't think we need to spend time on other proteins except actin and myosin. Okay? Again, with the different zones, right? H zone, A band, I band. If you're interested in what those would look like under the microscope as the muscle is contracting, then by all means look at that. But again, the bit I'm interested in is the Z line. Okay? On this diagram, we call it a Z disc. So, we said that the sarcomere is the most basic contractile unit, right? And what happens when we contract the muscle is those Z lines at each end of the sarcomere come closer together. And so we see shortening of the muscle under certain contraction types, okay? So the actin filaments, remember the myosin overlap the actin, and we see the actin filaments slide across the top of the myosin, and they drag because they're attached back there to the Z line. As they slide over the myosin, they pull the Z line in with them, and that's how we see shortening. Then, as the sarcomere relaxes, right, it gradually just relaxes back to its original position. So when it's short, there's a lot of overlap between the myosin and the actin. When it's relaxed, there's just a little bit of overlap there. Okay, and those two proteins, the thin filament, which is the actin, and the thick filament, which is the myosin, are what gives skeletal muscle its kind of stripy appearance, and so technically it's called striated muscle tissue. If you look at myocardium, it's myocardium? Yeah, it's not the same, right? If I look at the muscle of the heart, it doesn't look the same as skeletal muscle because the fibers aren't lined up in the same way. Okay. So let's look a bit more detail at the form of the actin and the myosin. So the actin, we call it actin as if it was just one molecule, but it's actually 3 different types of molecules all wrapped together. Okay? So we have 2 helixes of actin molecules, and they attach to the Z lines, and they have active sites on them where the head of the myosin can attach. So I'll show you that picture in a minute. So the myosin has little heads on it, and the head can attach to the receptor site on the actin. However, there are 2 other protein molecules also involved that are wrapped around in there. All right? One is called tropomyosin, and one is called troponin. Okay, so on the diagram, the tropomyosin is the yellow and green kind of ropey molecule, and the troponin is the blobby molecule here in the middle. Troponin has actually got 3 different units, but for me, you don't need those units. That's why I grayed that out. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, we're sticking with troponin. Okay. Questions? Hopefully this is all review. So the thick filament, the myosin filament, is made up of a head and a tail. Okay? So, and between the head and the tail there's a hinge element, so that the head can move independently of the tail moving, right? The head is made up of myosin ATPase. So remember when we did our energy systems, we said that ATPase is an enzyme that facilitates the breakdown of ATP. So the whole head of the myosin filament is made up of myosin ATPase. And actually there's 2 myosin molecules, has 2 heads and joined together, right? So the tail looks a bit like a tadpole or a sperm, a myosin molecule, right? So the tail of all the molecules wrapped together to kind of hold them into one protein, and that's what looks thick when we look at it through a microscope. So the bit of the myosin that attaches to the receptor site on the actin is this globular head, right? The myosin ATPase head of the molecule attaches to the receptor site. And then we see the breakdown of ATP, which is where all our ATP and needing our energy for muscle contraction comes from. Break down ATP, and the head can flick with that energy. Because it's attached to the actin, as it flicks, it drags the actin across itself. So we see the sliding of the actin across the myosin. Does that make sense? So the ATPase here is one of the elements that plays a role in whether or not the muscle is contracting slowly or more quickly, because it depends upon which form of ATPase the myosin head is made of. Okay, so we talked about slow motor units, right? Fast fatigue resistant units and fast fatigable units. Okay, and we said that they synapsed with different types of muscle fibers. Okay, so our first type of muscle fiber is called a type 1. When I was an undergrad, it was called a slow twitch fiber, but now they're called type 1s. So if you're interneting and things, make sure that you're using a up-to-date resource that is using the correct terminology. Okay? If you remember back to motor behavior, the muscle fiber types are pretty much set by 1, all right? In fact, they're set when you're born. There's about 10 to 15% of the muscle fibers haven't decided yet which ones they're going to be, but by the time you're 12, you've got the ratio of muscle fiber types that you're going to have as an adult. Okay? So type 1s, if you look at the graph here, okay, the blue line is our type 2, and the orangey red line is our type 1. And on our x-axis we have time, on our y-axis we have force. So our type 1 fibers are quite slow to get to their top force production before they start to relax. And that top force production is not as high as a type 2. Right? It doesn't mean that it's not strong and it can't produce a lot of force, but type 1s don't produce as much force as type 2s. Okay? But type 1s are really, really good at using oxygen to make ATP. So they're very, very good at using system 3 for ATP production. Okay? And because they're very good at using oxygen, it means that they don't fatigue very quickly. It takes a long, long time to fatigue type 1 fibers, right? So they're really great to do endurance activities, right? So if we look at a world-class 10K runner or marathon runner, they have a lot of type 1 fibers in their legs, right? If I look at a world-class sprinter, they don't have a lot of type 1 fibers in their legs. Okay? Our type 2 fibers, then, now we're looking at our blue line, okay? Our type 2 fibers don't take very much time to contract as hard as they can, right? And that peak contraction force is relatively higher than our type 1, right? So they can contract very quickly, very hard. However, they are not very good at using oxygen to make ATP, which means that they get fatigued very quickly because they're using predominantly system 1 and system 2. Right? So they're going to use the ATP-PC system and glycolysis, which means that they run out of steam pretty quickly. Okay? But it means that they're very good at fast, short, hard power events. sprinting, throwing, jumping. Right? So when we're born, as I said, mostly our ratio between type 1 and type 2 is set. Certainly by the end of year 1, it's set. Right? An average person has somewhere around 50-50, and all our muscles are different. It's not like I have 50-50 in my legs and I also have 50-50 in my arms. My arms may be different. But on average, right, a typical person has about half and half, type 1s and type 2s, right? So on average then, can I run a marathon? Yeah, sure. Can I run a marathon in 2 hours? No, and it won't matter how hard I train, I can't run a marathon in 2 hours. Can I run 100 meters? If you really made me. Can I do it in 9 or 10 seconds? No, right? But if we look at an elite endurance runner, then they're more likely to have somewhere between 70 to 85% of type 1 fibers instead of 50% type 1 fibers, right? And if we look at an elite sprinter, they're going to have 65 to 70% or more type 2 fibers, not 50% type 2 fibers. Okay? And that's part of the reason why they're as good as they are at their events. Plus, they put in a lot of work. But they had the physiology that putting in the work resulted in being an excellent sprinter or marathon runner, right? For the rest of us, it would just give us the opportunity to have a go at it, right? But we're never going to be great at it. Let's see, do I need to do any more today? We've got... Yeah, let's do a couple more. Okay. So, the textbook has several different mechanisms, discusses and explains several different mechanisms for isolating and categorizing the muscle fiber types. We're just going to stick with the myosin ATPase. And if you look at these slides, they've stained different muscle fiber types, different colors. And we go from the left, the most oxidative muscle fibers are type 1, and the least oxidative, the most powerful muscle fibers are type 2X. Now, what you want to be a little bit careful of when you're looking at this diagram is, in humans, at this point in time, the muscle fiber types that are identified are type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. So when they're looking, this slide is not human muscle tissue. It might be a cat, it could be a rat, I don't know what it is, but it's not human at this point in time. Now, it may be that we have these other muscle fiber types and they just haven't been identified yet, but at the moment these additional types are only identified in other critters, not us. Okay? So our basic muscle fiber types go from type 1, the most oxidative, the type that's innervated by a slow motor unit, to type 2A, which is much less oxidative, much better at using glycolysis, and is going to be stimulated by an FFR motor unit. And then our type 2X, which is the least oxidative, really crappy at using oxygen, but really great at using ATP, PC, and a little bit of glycolysis. Very powerful. And they're going to be stimulated by our fatigue resistant, our FR No, our fatigue. SFFRFF, fast fatigable motor units. Right. Okay, and there we will stop. And we will tackle sliding filament theory, which pulls all these ideas of the structure and organization of all the elements into a theory that explains muscle contraction. If you did your biology A&P, again, you'll have probably covered this, so hopefully some of it will be reviewed. That's always a good thing, because when we're learning it for the second, third, fourth time, we're more likely to remember it, all right? If you didn't do A&P, make sure that you've read your chapter so that you can follow along, okay? And we'll look at that on Friday. Today's Wednesday. Yeah, Friday. Okay. Any questions? No questions? Okay. How's everybody getting on with their physical activity logs and theory discussions? Because midterm is starting to loom very quickly. Is that you're not doing your physical activity logs and your theory discussions, or you don't have?
No, we're doing okay on it.
Okay. All right, remember, if you have any questions about any of that, try and pop into office hours. If you can't make the office hours, then email for an appointment if you want to chat with me about anything on those. Okay, as I said, midterm is looming fast already, because this is week 5 or 6. I've lost track already. But either way, that means midterms are coming up really soon. Okay, so get on top of that. If you're not on top of that, make sure that you get on top of that. Don't leave it until the last minute. Okay. Alrighty, I will see you guys tomorrow for lab.